Here is neuroscientist and Map Habit co-founder, Dr. Stuart Zola.
Well, hello everyone. It's Stuart Zola again with a new set of topics for us for this round. We're going to be talking about happiness. I hope everyone will wind up being happy by the end of this session. We'll also talk a little bit about sleep and some unusual things about sleep, particularly sleep in animals, in addition to sleep in humans. So let me get us started here by sharing my screen. And we will get moving. All right, well, we'll talk about the 7 habits of happiness as we get older. And then we'll talk a bit, as I said, about how to get some better sleep. Now, I'll start off with a little graph here, which actually shows some aspects of happiness throughout the lifespan. And people can measure this. Researchers measure happiness in individuals using various kinds of life satisfaction scales. We won't go into the details of that, but it just asks questions about certain events in your life and how happy you are with your current kind of status in life. And as you can see, different time periods, individuals, a very large percentage of individuals indicate that they are pretty happy. And that goes on for the first 40 or so years of our life. But then as we move into our 40s and 50s, our level of happiness seems to decline. And this is a general population study. Doesn't mean any of this is true for a single individual, but for the population in general, this is the pattern that the scientists saw. So we go down up until about age 60 or so. And then what happens? Well, we just pop right back up again, even higher than we were previously in our earlier, more formative years. So when we're in our 60s and 70s, it turns out we tend to at least perceive ourselves as pretty happy. And then a very funny thing happens as we move into our 70s and 80s. A kind of bifurcation happens. 2 different pathways begin to occur. Some individuals stay happy, in fact, get a little even more happy as we get older. And other individuals actually reduce their reports of being happy as we get older. And we'll talk about the distinction between those 2 groups as we move this discussion forward. When we think of happiness, think of it in some sense like your financial plans. You know, many of us have had 401ks to prepare us for later in life. Well, individuals have done the same thing in terms of happiness. We may not have been as conscious about doing it, but in terms of financial plans, many people realize the importance of making sound financial decisions early in life. And more likely, if they have done that well, they're able to support themselves in some comfort later in life. Some individuals don't do this, and it might be the case that they're less able to support themselves later in life. But the important thing is that we can teach ourselves to do some very specific kinds of things. And it doesn't matter what age we're at, even later in life, we can do these things to make our last decades much happier. In fact, in some cases, much, much happier. So think of this as the happiness 401k talk, as indicated on the right-hand side. These are all the kinds of terms that are associated with retirement and 401ks. And we're going to be talking about a particular study that actually began to unpack all of this idea of happiness throughout our lifespan. This is a study that was started in 1938 at Harvard Medical School. It's come to be called the study of adult development because it really talks about students in their early years at Harvard. This was all done with men students at Harvard. And they followed those individuals from their youth into their adulthood. And now, subsequent to that early part of the study has continued on for quite some time. And it has now gone on for over 80 years. So we have followed individuals really very much from their youth, as you can see in these pictures on the right-hand side, These pairs of pictures show the same individual as a youngster around college age, and then as an oldster. In some cases, individuals are 100 years old. So we can track not just the pictures of those individuals, not just what they look like, but we can see how people lived in their youth and then see how they turned out many decades later. And being able to track those individuals and lots of information about those individuals, the idea is that we can learn how to invest in your future of well-being, not just in your financial future, but in your future of healthy well-being. As participants got older, researchers categorized them with respect to happiness and health, along with a whole bunch of other variables. And we're only going to focus on those two aspects of happiness and health. Two distinct groups emerged at the extremes of the study. On the left-hand side, individuals are described as happy, well individuals. That is, they describe themselves as more happy, and their health was actually pretty good. On the right-hand side, the Harvard study labeled a different set of individuals as the sad, sick individuals. Doesn't sound very good, does it? But that's the short term that they use to communicate this idea. And these are individuals who were much less happy, in fact, sad individuals. And those are individuals who actually had many more health problems. They were more sick than the happy, well individuals. The happy, well individuals over on the left-hand side had good physical health, they had good mental health, and they had high life satisfaction. If you ask them about how satisfied are they with their life, what they've accomplished, how they feel about their life, it turns out they rated themselves pretty high. And the people on the right-hand side, as you might suppose, had below average scores in physical health. They had much poorer mental health. Depression and other kinds of things were more common in this group. And they reported lower satisfaction with their life up to that point. So when young accumulated resources and habits, if you accumulate resources and habits in your happiness 401k, then you in principle are going to be more in the happy well side than you are in the sad sick side. Now, we often don't have much control over that when we're young, and we don't and probably didn't know enough about doing that and how important it might be. But these are some of the things that the Harvard study found, that individuals who report a reasonable happy childhood, those are individuals who turned out happy well. Individuals who had longevity in their ancestors, their mothers and fathers or their grandparents lived for long periods of time into their 90s and hundreds, and individuals who avoided clinical depression, however that came about, whether it was on their own or whether they had a genetic disposition that protected them more from clinical depression, but they reported less cases of clinical depression in that population of the happy well than in the sad sick. So the differences between the two groups can really teach us a lot about how to plan for late life happy wellness. And the Harvard study found 7 data points, 7 points that indicated that if we invested in those and we made those kinds of decisions, that we would have a happier life. We would be more likely to be in the happy well group. I'm going to talk just briefly about each of these 7 points. The first is one that may surprise you because you wonder how can that have an impact on our life, but it turns out obviously it does in terms of medical conditions, and because of those medical conditions they impact our mental health and wellness as well. So the first one is these individuals in the Harvard study, they didn't smoke. And the idea that everybody talks about throughout the study, from the first year of the study through the 80 years of the study, is quitting smoking. If you already smoke, just quit smoking, because you can actually change things around by quitting smoking. You might not succeed on your first try, but you have to keep trying. And that's been the experience of the Happy Well group. Some did smoke to begin with, but then they stopped smoking. And the sooner you stop, the more smoke-free years you can invest in your happiness account. Think of it again as the 401k. It's the same metaphor that we'll keep using. And don't think that it's too late to matter. Dramatic changes really can happen to your body in just a few months after you stop smoking. The same is true for alcohol, same is true for drugs, other kinds of things in the same kind of category. So you shouldn't think that even if you're in your 70s, it may be too late to have any positive impact by stopping a particular habit. But the answer is, that's not true. You really can have significant impact even very late in your life when you change and modify behaviors and change habits. So don't think it's too late. It always matters. It's never too late to make that change. And smoking was a critical one that the Harvard study found that those happy, well individuals really managed. And the second, as we already alluded to, is watching your drinking. Alcohol abuse is strongly connected with smoking, and we already know what the damages are that smoking can do in terms of health and well-being. But alcohol consumption separate from smoking is actually one of the most, if not the most powerful predictor of winding up sad and sick. Chronic use and abuse of alcohol leads to a very wide range of health and mental health challenges. So if you have any indication of a problem drinking, if you have any indication that you are a problem drinker, doesn't matter if you're in your 70s or 80s, and if there are younger individuals as well, the idea is get help now. It's never too late to have an impact. And if you have a drinking problem in your family, this is the time. Don't take chances. If you already know that you have a genetic disposition in your family, then don't start drinking, because the drinking can overwhelm your ability to manage that genetic disposition. So the best advice is don't start drinking, especially if you have some family history. We have some experiences with that, and I think many individuals do, of individuals, a father who was an alcoholic, and the son sees that and doesn't want his children to go through the same experience that he went through when he was a youngster growing up with his alcoholic father. So he stops drinking and manages to do that very well and very effectively. So lots of ways that it can be done, lots of frameworks for helping individuals to manage, whether it's smoking or alcohol or any other kind of addiction. And although foregoing alcohol can be difficult, the reality is, according to all that the Harvard research has found, is you'll never be sorry that you made that decision. It really has a dramatic effect in dissociating happy, well, and sad, sick individuals. Maintaining a healthy body weight was the third most important piece, or the third of the 7. And that involved eating a diet with lots of fruits and vegetables. That's what those individuals tended to do. Moderate the serving sizes. Don't overboard it. I say that, and then this picture I realized I just showed is a pretty healthy order of salad and stuff, but at least it's healthy food there. Avoid yo-yo diets. Many of us go back and forth on various kinds of diets. And avoid restrictions that you can't maintain over the long run. Don't say, I am not going to have any more carbs any longer. Unrealistic, very likely. So you want to choose the kinds of decisions you make just as you would for your investments. You want to make those decisions wisely, so your 401k really will be useful for the future. The fourth thing is to prioritize movement. The healthy, well individuals all were individuals that exercised regularly. Now, we didn't use and don't like using the term exercise so much because it kind of scares people away. Everybody thinks about running a marathon or something like that. But the reality is that all you need to do is to do walking. Actually, the single best time-tested way to do healthy movement is to walk. Walking is probably the best thing you possibly can do. And for those of you who have been on a previous of our talks, you know we have various levels that have been researched in terms of numbers of steps that you can take that are the best for your health. And it's somewhere in the range of 4,000 to 10,000 steps a day is what people have arrived at. 4,000 seems to be the lower limit. You want to try and get at least 4,000 steps a day in. And in the range of 10,000 is highly correlated with your sustainability and longevity. So the important point here is when we talk about prioritizing movement, which is what the Harvard population did, it isn't the case that they ran marathons or 10Ks or out there every weekend at the gym. No, they actually did just what you see in this picture. They walked. So the most frequent kind of thing they did was walking. So keep that in mind as well. You don't have to run a marathon. You just have to move. One of the other important things that the Harvard population did in the Happy Well group is that they practiced coping mechanisms. They found healthy ways to deal with life's distress and how to do that better. They were more prepared. If you have ways that you can deal and manage with stress well, then if bad luck strikes you, and even if you're in your 80s and you have some strategies that you have developed and worked through, having those to be able to call upon turns out to be a really important and useful thing. Now, we have all in the last 2 years probably discovered many aspects of our own coping strategies that we never knew existed before. You know, we all had to cope with aspects of isolation and loneliness and the fear and stress of COVID itself and the sadness of losing some of our friends and family. All of those things have happened in the last 2 years in such a powerful, strong way. And many individuals have figured out, and fortunately either had already or then developed coping strategies that allow them to get through this period of time in much better shape than they otherwise would, and remain, in a sense, in the Happy Well group. So the notion is that you need to really avoid excessive rumination and unhealthy emotional reactions, or even avoidance behavior. You can't just pretend something isn't there. You have to figure out how to realize it is there and how to cope with it effectively. This little cartoon on the right-hand side of the picture just shows some of the benefits from being able to teach coping strategies or being able to learn coping strategies, because it does build some confidence. You are prepared to meet head on some kinds of stresses. It will help you manage those stresses. It improves your independence, helps you manage your emotions. So lots of benefits to learning coping strategies. And the Happy Well Harvard group and population understood that very early on and they utilize those and develop those coping strategies throughout their life. So when they're in their 70s and 80s, they already had foundational habits to help them get through. And that is true even for the last 2 years or so with COVID. Individuals who had some of those strategies in place already fared much better during the COVID pandemic than individuals who didn't have those abilities in place. And again, it's not too late to begin to develop those. In fact, there are courses all around available in universities and living facilities that teach you coping strategies. So it's never too late to learn how to do these things better because many of us still have many years ahead. And you want those years to be in the happy, well group. One of the other important aspects of this is something that we all do and cherish. You wouldn't be on this webinar if you weren't thinking about and doing these kinds of things, and that is keeping on learning. Keep learning. The more education you have, the more active your mind remains in old age as we get older, and you tend to have a longer and happier life. You don't need to go to Harvard. You don't have to be enrolled in a PhD program or a master's program or anything like that. All you have to do is engage in lifelong purposive learning. That could be even taking up a hobby and learning about a hobby. It could be drawing, it could be magic, it could be knitting, it could be reading. Reading's a great example, by the way, because you can read, and that in many ways can take you out of a stressful environment. And you often can learn new things from reading. If you read nonfiction, for example, as part of your routine, then you're learning about new subjects, you're learning about new areas. And all of those things, by the way, are growing new brain connections. I'm going to put my hands up here for a second just to say that growing new brain connections is an important part. And we now understand you can do that no matter your age. It doesn't matter if you're in your 70s or 80s. You can actually grow new brain connections and new brain cells. And the more of those connections you make and the more of those cells you make, then the more you can stand to lose later on if things like Alzheimer's or other kinds of neurodegenerative diseases becomes part of your life. You have a better chance of sustaining the quality of life for a longer period of time, the more connections and the more brain cells you have, because it's going to take a longer time for those to be disrupted and be lost. So it's a simple matter of just like the investment metaphor. Just keep learning, keep doing these things because you keep building up your supply, your kind of bankroll of these things. And when hard times come, it's going to take you longer to be impacted by it. So that's the very important aspect of continuing to learn. And then finally, number 7 is to cultivate stable, long-term relationships. This can be marriage. It can be any relationships with family or friends, partners, any that fill this category of stable, long-term relationships. The point is to find people with whom you can grow, whom you can count on no matter what comes your way. These are people that you can really share things with. You can tell things to them or share things with them that you might not with other people, even with other family members, but you have this close relationship that you can. And these are people, again, that you can count on, so to speak. And the Harvard group was very clear about this and the importance of being able to cultivate those kinds of relationships. We, again, found this to be the case during the pandemic. We began to develop relationships that we might not otherwise have developed, and those subsequently turned out to be very warm and close and long-lasting relationships. It's like being through the war, in a sense, and having survived that. It has a special kind of bonding associated with it. So cultivate stable, long-term relationships And again, even if you're in your 70s and 80s, you can still develop these relationships. It doesn't mean that these have to be lifelong relationships. These can start and become very significant and strong, even at this time. And we can point back to the pandemic for many examples of how that has happened, where people who didn't know each other before literally have become the closest and so-called lifelong friends. So those are the 7 important kinds of behaviors that were more prominent on the happy, well side. And that's what we want to strive for. Now, although not in the top 7, let me just come back to this. It's great if you can do all of those 7, or if you've done all of those 7. That's the best way to maximize your chance of happy, well kind of person. But if it is the case that you can't do all those, or some kinds of things you can't do, then according to the Harvard study, the single most important trait, if you had to choose one of those 7, it was healthy relationships, the last one we talked about. So healthy relationships really turn out to be critically important in terms of your well-being. And it does suggest that well-being can be built, and the best building blocks are good, warm relationships. We have a good sense of that. But again, the COVID pandemic, although it has been a brutal time, it's been an important, informative, and learning time for all of us about what our capabilities are and what we can do. And building these relationships is one of those things that occurred very often as a result of the pandemic. The people we know and love sometimes, however, can be the source of stress themselves. But they also challenge us, and they engage us in thinking and sharing emotions and feeling needed. It's important to feel needed, and these relationships help us to accomplish that. So it's a little bit of a double-edged sword in a sense, this idea of these relationships. You just need to know yourself and choose those individuals wisely, that you know you're have a kind of simpatico with. Now, although not in the top 7, another important happy, well habit has to do with sleep. And this brings us to the second part of our talk. We talk about the impact of sleep over on the left-hand side of the slide. If you have joined us in previous talks, we've really had some discussions about sleep before, and know about the various stages of sleep, the dream stages of sleep, and the important stages where memory consolidation happens. We know we go through several stages and cycles of sleep every night. But the impact of sleep is important for us because it does help the brain clear out waste. We know now from some recent discoveries, we've talked about this before, that the brain changes in a particular way during sleep and opens up some spaces to allow waste to be washed out, essentially, from the brain. Certain kinds of biochemical activities that go on during the day deposit some detritus, and we can get rid of that waste during the sleep stage. And sleep does many other things. It supports our digestive system, it supports our immune system and our cardiovascular system. And pretty much every physiological and mental process as well, whether it's large or small, really is affected by sleep. So you can't understate or overstate how important sleep is. And when your sleep schedule is disrupted, when it's not working the right way, think of it as an orchestra without a conductor. An orchestra without a conductor is hard to play a symphony. You can't get all the pieces organized in the way they have to. The conductor really has an important role there. And if your sleep schedule is messed up, then it really is a mess. You don't hear a symphony, you just hear cacophony of sounds, disconnected sounds. Those of you who have traveled, perhaps to other countries and from the United States or vice versa, know the difficulty of trying to get your sleep cycle back in sync when you travel across the ocean. It can sometimes be very difficult, and it turns out it's somewhat more difficult as we age. My wife and I experienced this just recently on a European trip where we had to be, not had to be, but we went to the wedding of our son. And we were in a country that was 6 hours out of sync with where we were in Atlanta on the day we left. So it took us some time to readjust to that. And we were there for 9 or so days. And by the time we were just starting to shift into the right sleep cycle, of course, then we came back and boom, we're disrupted all over again. And having traveled lots during my career, it never used to disrupt me as much, never used to bother me as much. But I did notice as we've gotten older, it is more difficult to manage the sleep cycle changes. It takes a longer time to get resynced into the geographic area that you're in. So sleep really impacts a whole bunch of things. When you have that kind of disruption, you have lots of other kinds of difficulties as well. It's just not a healthy situation for your body. One could ask, how long can you go without sleep? How much sleep do you need? And we often talked and have in a couple of sessions ago, when we did the session on sleep, we talked about 7 to 8 or 9 hours, somewhere in that range, is about what we do sleep on average. But scientists are exploring how to get the benefits of sleep with many fewer hours of sleep. Could it be the case that we could learn how to sleep less and therefore have more awake hours to either be more productive or more leisurely or whatever we want to do with those hours? There are some individuals who have a genetic mutation that's identified as the early LARC mutation. And these are individuals who actually can go to sleep early at night, but they wake up very early in the morning and sleep only a few hours and seem to function very well by all kinds of assessments that they take on reaction time and cognitive tests, other kinds of things about their abilities. They function perfectly normally. So it's not very common. So far, it's been seen in a small population of individuals. But nevertheless, there are such individuals. You might ask yourself whether you might be among those. Some of you listening or watching might have that genetic disposition. There are other families that are known as natural short sleepers. They don't have that genetic marker, but they do require very little sleep, and they seem, again, to manage very well. There are other possibilities that scientists are working on using various kinds of electrical stimulation of the brain, and magnetic stimulation of the brain to induce deep sleep so that you can be well rested for consistent time, as opposed to going through these cycles of deeper and lighter sleep. You just stay in this deep sleep. So you have to sleep less to get the benefit of that deep sleep. And there are other kinds of approaches of acoustic simulation, various tones that people play on their earphones that are thought to enhance slow wave sleep. Slow wave sleep, remember, is essential for memory consolidation, for consolidating the information that has happened in the last 24 hours and helping your memory to retain that information. All of these are still a little bit science fiction-y. They're being practiced in research labs, but they're certainly not ready for prime time. The devices themselves are pretty impractical to have in your home. And it's not entirely clear how safe they are. As a matter of fact, we don't have long-term studies about what happens after people go through these electrical stimulations or other kinds of things over a long period of time. So don't try this at home, right? It's just an interesting idea about sleep and the question of how much sleep do we really need. We're going to look at ourselves compared to other primates in just a moment. But that's the question to ask. There are really some other primates. We sleep more than most other primates. In fact, than all other primates that have been studied. And the question is, why is that? I said that wrong. We actually sleep less than most other primates. And so the question is, why is that? We'll talk about that possibility. But here are some things to enhance your sleep, the kinds of things you should be thinking about to get better sleep. Over on the left-hand side, one is simply to stick to a consistent schedule to keep your circadian rhythm in sync. You don't want to get that rhythm out of sync. That's what happens when you displace yourself into different geographic time zones where the world is out of sync with you by 6 or 7 or 8 hours. Get enough daily sunlight exposure. We know how important sunlight is to regulating your circadian rhythm. So you want to keep those sleep patterns always attuned to the naturalness of the sun and darkness. Eat healthfully. Sugars and carbs. Carbs can include alcohol. All of this is associated with lighter and less restorative sleep. And also with middle of the night wakings. You may think that a drink of alcohol or a few drinks of alcohol are going to help you sleep at night. And they do for a period of time. But then there's a dramatic dip in the carbohydrates and you will suddenly have a middle of the night awakening. So not very useful. And all of these things, carbs and sugars and fats, all associated with acid reflux, which is also a very unpleasant way to spend the night. So eat healthfully if you can, in terms of enhancing your sleep possibilities. Naps, we had a whole session on naps recently and how important they are. Very good and very useful things to do, especially if you might not be getting enough night's sleep. But important that there's a limit where the naps are effective. If you start napping after about 3 o'clock in the afternoon, that's likely to affect your ability to sleep at night. So your naps should be in the 12, 1, 2 o'clock range. And remember, only about 20 minutes or so. A nap can't be much longer than that. Otherwise, it becomes a real sleep episode, and the whole impact of that is quite different. When you nap, you awake from a nap much sharper and clearer. When you sleep, you do not wake from a sleep episode sharper and clearer. You're much more drowsy and other kinds of things that you experience. Exercise and moving, especially in the morning. It's fine to exercise in the evening, but not too close to when you're trying to get to sleep. Otherwise, your system is going to be still pretty juiced up and it's going to be hard to get into sleep mode, both physiologically and biochemically. So keep at least 2 hours between the end of your evening exercise, if you exercise in the evening, and your sleep. Minimize your stress before getting into bed. You know, we often worry, what are we doing tomorrow? We have lots of things. Well, just make a to-do list and use that to try to minimize your thought about it during trying to get to sleep. Just write it down, forget it. It's going to be there for the morning for you. You know what you have to do. And then think about other things as you're trying to sleep, not about those things. Don't procrastinate. Over the right-hand side, don't procrastinate. This is a really chronic kind of condition that we have, especially as people are trying to catch up with all of the Netflix and HBO Max and Disney shows and just binging on all of these shows all the time because there are so many episodes and so many years of episodes that people try to watch. So the decision to put off going to bed when there's no external reason for doing so. And by external reason, we mean a real reason, like an injury or an illness or some emergency, but not watching an episode. I'm just going to watch one episode. And then, as you know, these systems are very wise. So as the episode is ending, they already have a little clicker in the corner of the screen where you just touch it and they'll start the next episode right away. So you don't even get a chance to pause between them. And then suddenly you're 2 or 3 hours into these episodes. So be careful of that. And this idea of sleep procrastination is becoming really a chronic condition here in the United States, especially. So unplug before bedtime. One of the ways to get around this is just unplug. Don't put your phone, don't put your laptop next to your bed at night. Put it in another room if you can, so you can't even get to it easily. That is an important strategy to use. Plus, it reduces the possibility of light. The more you're watching these kinds of things, the more the message is getting to your brain that it's more daylight, because the waveforms, the wavelength of these computer screens, especially if they're up close to your eyes, is signaling that it's daylight. So you really need to avoid doing that if you want to get a good night's sleep. Finally, the last couple of things: adjust your pillows. Your head, neck, and spine are resting in one line. They should be. And if your pillow is straight up, that's not going to do a good job of that. So you want to try, if you're a side sleeper or a back sleeper or stomach sleeper, you want to try always to have this straight line from your head to your neck and your spine all the way down. And then another strategy is just read until you can't stay awake. You don't have to watch TV or iPads or iPhones or anything. Just read a story. Reading fiction can take you away from the day's activities. And also just read until you feel sleepy. And as you feel sleepy, you just put the book down, shut your light out, and continue to drowse off. And then the final one: don't stay in bed if you can't sleep. It sounds a little paradoxical that if you get up, then how are you going to sleep? But lots of people can't sleep and they stay in bed ruminating about not sleeping. And that's not going to help, because it just creates a negative association between the bed and sleep. So just get up and do some activity for a little bit, and then try to get back to bed again. Excuse me. All right. Last thing about sleep has to do with animals. Lots of animals have different sleep habits and sleep abilities. And so you think of which animal are you like in terms of your sleep habits. Elephants just rest periodically throughout the day for 2 hours a day, but they can go for several days without any sleep. And they can lay down to sleep only every third or fourth night. I hope none of us are elephants in terms of our sleep. We know much about their sleeping habits because researchers have these little electronic trackers that they can put under the skin of the elephant in their trunks. And if the trunk stays still for 5 minutes or longer, that's a signal the animal is asleep. And so they do that, but they don't do that for very long. They do it for a couple of hours and then move on. Giraffes, they sleep no more than 5 minutes at a time, or maybe in total about 30 minutes a day. And that's in part because they're herbivores and they need to spend a lot of their time getting food. They munch and munch and munch on vegetables and trees and things to get the same amount of energy that a lion, for instance, gets in a single hunt. A lion will take down a zebra or some other kind of creature and get a huge amount of protein and other kinds of things in just that single takedown. But for herbivores, they don't have that advantage. They have to eat a lot. And then for giraffes in particular, if they slept for many hours, they would be really vulnerable to predators like the lion that's looking for that one meal. So lions and tigers can rest up to 20 hours a day. They just kind of relax for much of the day. They go out and make their kill, and then they have what they need, and then they rest for the rest of the time. Dolphins, very interestingly, often use only half of their brain. They have two sides of their brain, and one side can work quite independently of the other side. And so one side can sleep while the other side is controlling all the activities of the dolphin. You may have read recently about the war in Russia with the Ukraine, with the Russian dolphins that are guarding the Russian harbors and protecting them from some of the attacks in the Russian ships. So dolphins have been trained. They're used by many countries in training for protective purposes. And there's been a number of stories just in the last 48 hours about dolphins and guarding the harbor. And finally, we mentioned earlier about primates, and primates have various sleep spans. And as I mentioned, humans, as it turns out, are the shortest sleeping of the primates. So some primates sleep as long as 16 or 17 hours a day, and all the way down to the range. Here's chimpanzees, kind of our closest living relative. They sleep on average about 9 hours a day, a little more than 9 hours a day, but humans on average are sleeping only about 7. We often talk about 7, 8, or 9 hours, and 8 hours as the kind of average. But as we have learned now in recent research, that has really moved down now. So the average human sleeps only about 7 hours a night. And so chimpanzees sleep still more than we do. And it's not entirely clear why humans have moved down the chain here to be the lowest amount of sleeping primate. One of the possibilities is we moved from sleeping in trees to sleeping on the ground, and that meant we became more vulnerable to predators ourselves. So we had to learn to change our mode of sleep. Lots of hypotheses about that. We're not going to answer that in this session, but just to say the interesting point that we have become the least sleeping primate of all the primates in the world. All right, well, we have covered a lot of territory here. The 7 habits of happiness, and lots of information about sleep as well. It's all listed here on this last slide. If you have the ability, you should just snap a screenshot of this, because it's really the summary of the talk. The point here is that all of these kinds of behaviors about not smoking, about managing carefully your drinking, I should come back to that and just say it isn't the case that we're suggesting you can't drink at all. It's the case that you just have to be mindful and watchful of it. And especially be mindful if you have some family history or some reasons to worry about overusing alcohol. Much of the data that's come out most recently, we actually did talk about this on the last talk, does suggest that even small amounts of alcohol, 1 drink a day, although usually touted as fine and safe, turns out researchers now are discovering that even that 1 drink a day actually does change your brain. And if you are especially vulnerable for various reasons, you have some kinds of vulnerability, that 1 drink a day may not be such a good idea for you. So just be mindful of that. Maintain your healthy body weight, prioritize movement, just get out there and start walking. Learn these coping mechanisms, learn how to manage this better, and continue to keep learning and cultivate relationships. All of these and all of these things we talked about in the last part of the talk on sleep, all of these really are habits. And I'm just reminding you of that. Even the title of this was the 7 Habits of Happiness. And these are all habits that we can learn or unlearn depending on what the particular topic is, but they're all habits, and habits really can sustain us. One of the most important examples that we began to see of the power of habits really was in the COVID pandemic. As we are going through the pandemic, we really came to depend on habits, whether it was wearing masks or washing your hands or doing other kinds of things. We came to depend very strongly on those habits to get us through the times. And they did so effectively. All right, well, I want to thank you. This has been brought to you by Map Habits. This is a company that really focuses on the ability of habits to help individuals get through their activities of daily living, whether they have cognitive impairments or whether they just are caught up in the hustle and bustle of life. Developing various kinds of habits to get us through those kinds of daily activities turn out to be important. And this company that, in all disclosure, full disclosure, it was on the first slide, I'm a co-founder of and the chief science officer of, but it has a focus on being able to help individuals do that. And www.maphabit.com is the website. Glad to have you check on the website, and glad to communicate with you if you think that may be beneficial. So I'm going to turn it back to you, Tom, and thank you all very much.
All right, welcome back, everybody. Sorry about that. I had a little issue with my sound. So, Dr. Zola, I think we covered a lot of things there. For me, it's sleep. That's one of my things. I know I'm worthless without it.
Yeah, well, you're not alone on that one at all. It turns out to be such an important component for us. And although it wasn't in the top 6 of the Harvard study, it was in the Harvard study and turned out to be important enough to add to the list.
Absolutely. If anybody has any questions, you can drop them in the Q&A, or you can raise your hand and we can try to unmute you and get you squared away there. I'm trying to change my view here so that I can see people as we get to them. Right now, I don't see any questions in the Q&A. One thing I definitely did that I think really paid a dividend as far as my sleep went was I moved my charging station for my devices into my closet. And that was a huge thing. It really killed all the beeps and bops. And of course, all those devices have ways to mute themselves, but a lot of people worry that they're going to miss an important phone call or something. So I moved it into another room. And I also went around with painter's tape, which doesn't leave any residue on anything. And I covered up those horrible little LEDs on all our devices. And, the clock radio is even muted, in our room. So you can see the time, but it's not blasting into the room all the time. So that's part of sleep hygiene. And I really think that paid off for me. Doesn't look like we have any questions at this time. Let me make sure here with my view of the attendees, see if anybody has a hand raised. No, I think we're good.
Okay.
All right. I'd like to thank you for being with us today, everybody. And thank you, Dr. Zola, for another great presentation.
Thanks, Tom, and thanks, everyone. Look forward to next month.
We'll see you next month.
Bye-bye.